I passed purple crocuses on the way here. So I take that as a good omen, those of you who might be looking for omens today. I'm Kerry Buckley, and on behalf of Historic Northampton and in partnership with the Smith College History Department, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the fourth lecture in the 350th Anniversary Lecture Series. These lectures are funded by the Massachusetts Foundation for the Humanities with promotional support from WFCR Public Radio. And as I have said before, and will say again, we're very fortunate to have the flagship office of the Massachusetts Foundation for the Humanities right here in Northampton, contributing not only to the cultural vitality of our own community, but supporting quality programs like this one throughout the state. And we're pleased today to have the director of the Foundation's Boston office here, and I'd like you to welcome Ellen Rothman. You want to stand up, Ellen? Take a bow. Ellen's our cultural ambassador to Capital. As our community ponders the legacy of 350 years, I want to remind you that our work here at Historic Northampton will not be over at the end of the anniversary year, but will be just beginning, really, and we'll be working to sustain the quality of programs like this for the 351st, for the 352nd, and for those who will be celebrating our 450th anniversary. And we depend on memberships to help defray our operating expenses, and we face a task here. We must grow our membership exponentially if we're going to meet the needs of the 21st century. So I invite you to become a member of Historic Northampton. You can do that by filling out the card at the back of your program, the insert there, and returning it either to the table in the lobby in the back or mailing it to the address on the card. I encourage you to consider that. I also want to remind you that these lectures, along with other articles, will be collected in an anthology and published with the University of Massachusetts Press. A place called Paradise, Culture and Community in Northampton, Massachusetts, 1654 and 2004, will be available this year, late this year, at the close of our anniversary celebrations. You can reserve a copy of this book by filling out the enclosed card, another card in your program, dropping it off at the table or sending it to us. And if you're watching on cable TV, you can reserve your copy by calling 584-6011. In the 17th century, daily life in Northampton was plain and at least outwardly modest. Most households had few possessions, little more than the basic necessities in one or at most two multi-purpose rooms. But despite the appearance of an orderly community, outward conformity sometimes masked tensions that lay below the surface. Social position was often hotly contested. Court documents reveal claims and counterclaims about property and debts, slander, charges like lascivious carriage, and in the case before us today, witchcraft. John Putnam Demos is one of America's most prominent scholars on the early colonial period. He is Samuel Knight Professor of American History and Professor of American Studies at Yale University. He's the author of many books and essays, including A Little Commonwealth, Family Life in Plymouth Colony, and The Unredeemed Captive, a family story from early America, chronicling the Eunice Williams story from the 1704 raid on Deerfield. His widely acclaimed book on 17th century witchcraft, Entertaining Satan, won the Bancroft Prize in American History. And he comes to speak to us today on Hard Thoughts and Jealousies, study of Northampton's Goudy Parsons witchcraft case, which began more than 40 years before those notorious events in Salem. So it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Demos and give him a round of applause.
Thank you very much, and it's a real pleasure to be here with you today. I'm very astonished and pleased by the turnout. I had no idea there would be so many Witchcraft fans in Northampton, or maybe it's Northampton history fans. In fact, I am rather suddenly prompted to remember from many years ago now, when I first began to approach the whole subject of witchcraft history, and therefore to give lectures here and there about it. But actually, those were some of the biggest audiences, I suppose, I've ever spoken to. And I'm talking about kind of the 1970s, basically. I think the reasons they were big audiences then are a little different from today. Typically, in the 70s, when I would be invited to give a lecture on witchcraft history, a large part of the sometimes large turnout were witchcraft practitioners. And I learned, in fact, and I'm willing to make the same, give the same forewarning today, that I'm not connected to witchcraft as a practitioner at all. It used to, in fact, sometimes happen back then that I would be also in one or another social setting and would be introduced to someone. Here's a witch. We think we might have some meaningful conversation. It was a big misunderstanding. I'm going to indulge, if you'll indulge me, I'm going to just give you a couple of other memories of talks back then. One such talk occurred at Williams College, up the road. And one of the things you learn as a witchcraft scholar is it's kind of a risky business. Strange things can happen. In the middle of that lecture, the lights in the building went out, so I was looking a little nervously overhead. And I was brought a flashlight so I could continue the lecture. I somehow got through the end. Another lecture was at that well-known place in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Harvard University. And again, there was a big turnout. And in the middle of the lecture, a group of people sort of in the middle of the hall stood up and said very forcefully that they needed to say something and I should stop. They pronounced a curse on the whole proceeding. I could go on in this vein. I haven't given a lecture on witchcraft for a good many years, but I do find myself feeling just a tad nervous as I start in here. Okay, the Northampton witchcraft story, something with which I spent a good deal of time, quite a number of years ago now. In fact, in many ways, this experience is a little like revisiting a former life, revisiting witchcraft, revisiting Northampton, where I actually haven't set foot in the town probably in 25 years, and even revisiting, in the case of the Northampton witchcraft story, revisiting individuals with whom I was for a time, in some ways, quite close. One of the things I love about being in the history business, in fact, is actually being able to encounter, in a sense, individual people who lived and breathed and died hundreds of years ago. And if you do it for a long time and with a good deal of focus, you really do get a sense of what they were like as individuals. I mean, these particular individuals. I used to have dreams about some of the people I encountered in my witchcraft research. I can't honestly say that I remember a dream about Mary Parsons or other Northampton folks, but anyway, I had that kind of experience of closeness, even with Mary Parsons. So kind of going back into it in the last few days in preparation for this lecture was, in a sense, like reconnecting with real people, almost. The Northampton witchcraft story, which I'm about to tell you, should really be seen as part of a larger, in context, as part of a larger pattern of witchcraft belief and actions based on such belief that was pervasive in early New England, certainly in the 17th century. One of the things that I was most concerned to achieve in my own witchcraft studies when I began in the 1960s was to sort of right the balance of popular understanding of this subject by, in effect, by de-emphasizing the idea that Salem witchcraft was this one-of-a-kind, bizarre happening in the early 1690s, which has, of course, fascinated us ever since. And by the same token, to raise up the notion that witchcraft really was, as I think I put it in maybe the first page of my book, part of everyday life for all sorts of people back then, in places like Northampton and in virtually every other place as well. In fact, it's my firm belief that every early New England community had its own witch, so to speak, or maybe even 2 or 3 witches, by which I mean that people in the community believed that so-and-so was a witch. That this didn't necessarily lead to trials in court, but it was very much a part of everyday experience, certainly a part of everyday gossip, and worry and doubt and all sorts of other feelings, I think, as well. And the Northampton case is very typical of that aspect of the broader picture of early New England history. When I made a kind of count years ago of all of the New England cases that I was able clearly to identify, the total ran to well over 100, comprising almost every town of any size, I think, in the region in the 17th century. These cases were ordinarily kind of small in scope and local in their geographic dimensions. Typically just 1 or 2 people suspected and or charged at a single time. They were clearly rooted in humble circumstances, personal and family animosities. Their content, so to speak, had to do with the particulars of work and property and personal misfortune and things of that sort. And again, I think the Mary Parsons case is, the Northampton case is exactly in that mode. So without any further ado, let me plunge right in. This is a story, as I see it, which stretches over more than 50 years. In fact, we can't really make out its beginning and its end. We don't even know exactly what date would be appropriately assigned to the beginning and the end of the story. What we can see is some points that lie in the middle of the story, quite vividly represented, especially in 2 particular court cases. The 1656, the first of these cases in 1656, Parsons versus Bridgman for slander, and the 1674 case in which Mary Parsons was charged in a formal way with performing acts of witchcraft. I'm going to speak about each of these cases in a sort of narrative mode for a few minutes and then move to some attempts at more interpretive thoughts and reflections. The 1656 slander case first. Here's how the case is summarized on the court docket from that year. Quote, Joseph Parsons, plaintiff, against Sarah, the wife of James Bridgman, defendant, in an action of the case for slandering her in her name. This is Joseph Parsons on behalf of his wife, Mary, accusing this woman, another local woman in Northampton, Sarah Bridgman, the wife of James Bridgman, of having slandered Mary Parsons. That's all it says, except it also adds the verdict, which was for the plaintiff. And the order of the court that the defendant must, quote, make public acknowledgement, unquote, of the wrong she had done in this slander twice, once in Springfield and once in Northampton. A kind of very straightforward and spare and, in a sense, unrevealing notation of what was actually at issue here. Because after you read this summary in the court docket, then you go to open up the depositional file, all the testimonies that were offered in the case. And one of the first things you learn is that this was really a case about witchcraft, although that word is not mentioned in the summary. There are, in fact, 33 different depositions, 33 different testimonies given by 24 different witnesses. And there are also some other individuals who are mentioned as in the course of the depositions as having had a part to play in the case. And when you kind of add up the score on all this, you find that 15 out of, or what I was able to determine anyway, is that 15 out of the then 32 households of Northampton were directly involved in this court proceeding. That's almost half of all the households in Northampton. And there were also 7 more households in Springfield, just down the way, that were also involved. So the first point to make about all this, I guess, is that there was a high degree of local involvement. A lot of people were interested in this and directly taking part. Now, when you look at the full file of these 33 depositions, as a historian, you try to figure out how to sort of break them up and figure out how they connect with each other. And I think the long and the short of that process is that they fall into 4 main batches. The first batch of depositions, that is to say first in time, I think they were these 4 spread out over a few months. I forget the details, but they're sort of maybe a month apart, more or less. The first batch is a group of testimonies that were clearly all meant to be on the side of the plaintiff, to make the case that Joseph Parsons, on behalf of his wife, who had been supposedly slandered, to make the case that he had raised with the court. By and large, these depositions, this first batch, are all about things that Sarah Bridgman, the alleged slanderer, the accused slanderer, was supposed to have said to one or another of her friends and neighbors in town. And I'll just read one somewhat randomly chosen deposition so you can get the flavor of this piece of the evidence. Robert Bartlett testifieth that George Langdon told him the last winter that Goody Bridgman and Goody Goodwife, we would say Mrs. Wife of, Goody Bridgman and Goody Branch were speaking about Mary Parsons concerning her being a witch. And the said George told the said Robert that my wife, that's Langdon's wife, being there, said she could not think so, which the said Goody Bridgman seemed to be distasted with. She was displeased with, I guess we would say. As also, according to Langdon, they had hard thoughts of the wife of the said Robert Bartlett because she was intimate with the said Mary Parsons, and so forth and so on. So this is an account of gossip between a couple of women in the town, and there are many more like it. And the point of all of these testimonies is that Sarah Bridgman, in one way or another, was trying to persuade people around town that Goody Parsons was a witch, that Mary Parsons was a witch, and was doing a lot of bad stuff. Okay, the second batch of depositions comes along a few weeks later, and it's quite different. But these depositions are clearly given on behalf of the defendant in this case, namely Sarah Bridgman, trying to explain and, in a real sense, justify what she had been saying about Mary Parsons. So the gist of them is all that brought her to suspect Mary Parsons of being a witch. And again, I'll just offer you a brief example. One of the things that obviously made Sarah Bridgman think and feel this way was that she had recently born an infant child, and that child had died under what she thought were strange and suspicion-arousing circumstances soon after its birth. So here's the kind of thing she said in specific reference to that matter. I being brought to bed about 3 days after, as I was sitting up, having the child in my lap, there was something that gave a great blow on the door. And that very instant, as I apprehended, my child changed. And I thought to myself, and told my girl, I think she had a servant girl nearby, that I was afraid my child would die. Presently, I, looking towards the door through a hole, I saw 2 women pass by the door with white clothes on their heads. Then I concluded my child would die indeed. And I sent my girl out to see who they were, but she could see nobody. And this made me think there is wickedness in this place. So the child, she says, there's this banging on the door, which makes no sense. That's something very peculiar and suspicious. The child suddenly looks kind of different and distressed. And then she looks outside and she sees these 2 kind of ghost-like figures, I guess, which when her servant girl goes to kind of check, just there's nobody there. The whole thing is very spooky from her point of view, and then a few days after that, I think, the child dies. And other kinds of testimony appears in this same second group. And it's not just from Sarah Bridgman either. It's from some of her neighbors who support her in her suspicions of Mary Parsons. One woman comes in and says that she had been doing some spinning, some textile work for Mary Parsons, and every time she tried to spin, in just the same way she always did, it never came out right. It always got sort of fouled up. And another man came in and said that his cows had died under very strange and suspicious circumstances. So a variety of stuff of that sort, which in effect is all designed to show that this isn't really slander, this is very well-founded suspicion. Okay, moving right along, we come to the third batch of depositions. Now we switch back to the plaintiff's side of things. We have several more testimonies, some of which are offered in direct rebuttal to what had been said by Sarah Bridgman's supporters and defenders in the second group. Let me see if I can come up with... Well, I don't see anything. I thought I had I can just summarize briefly. Basically, these witnesses now, again, these are on the side of Mary Parsons. They said, I think there was a midwife who came in and said, look, that baby that Sarah Bridgman had and then lost in just a few days or weeks was sickly from the moment it was born. We didn't think there was any chance that it was going to die. And I think another guy came in and said that the man who thought his cow had been strangely attacked by witchcraft and then had died, that cow had clearly also been affected by some kind of natural cause. And so, in a sense, diminishing or even trying to demolish the testimonies along that line. There was also, by the way, I think in that, I guess I should have said this about the second batch, the first group that went against Mary Parsons. There was an interesting testimony about a much earlier witchcraft case, or several years earlier, that had happened down the river in Springfield, where basically the children of the minister's family had suddenly developed fits of the sort that people usually associated with witches and witchcraft. Although the focus in that earlier case had been on these children, the minister's children, Mary Parsons, who was then living in Springfield, just a bit before she came to Northampton, had also kind of involved herself in a strange way. She had claimed that she too was feeling some fit-like difficulties. And indeed, some people thought that she supposedly, and I think this is exactly the way it's worded in the records, walked on water and was not wet. This is strange and interesting phrasing, but she was, in a way, maybe involved on both sides of that earlier case, and this was remembered now in the Parsons-Bridgman slander case of 1656. Okay, and finally, the fourth and last of these depositional batches in the slander case, again, go back on the side of the defendant, and actually, their emphasis is about peculiarities of one sort or another in Mary Parsons' past. They include some of the stuff about the Springfield witchcraft case several years earlier. They also allude in possibly telling ways to difficulties sort of that Mary Parsons had with her husband in her household. Here's, I think I do have, yeah. One man remembers talking to Joseph Parsons, Mary's husband, and recalls specifically this. He said, Joseph Parsons said to his wife, that she was led by an evil spirit. Thereupon, she said he was the cause of it by locking her into the cellar and leaving her behind. She said also that when her husband locked her into the cellar was full of spirits, and she threw the bedstaff at them and the bedclothes and her pillow too, and yet they would not be gone. And from this time forward, she told me it was that she fell into her fits some days after. She said the spirits appeared to her like puppets, little dolls, as she was washing her clothes at the brook, and then she fell into fits. So this is clearly stuff that was elicited by the Springfield witchcraft case. I know the trail is getting kind of complicated here, but the basic point is that Mary Parsons had seemed a little odd in things that she was saying and doing for some considerable number of years before, including some in reference to that earlier case in Springfield. So it kind of goes backwards and forwards, to and fro. A group on the side of Mary Parsons, who in this case is a plaintiff, a group on the other side, and so forth and so on. It's a kind of power struggle, in effect, that one sees going on here in this case. It's clear that Mary Parsons has not only her detractors and accusers in the community, but has a significant number of supporters. In the end, it's her side, Mary Parsons' side, that wins out. One of the things that, I won't go into all the details here, but one of the things that happens is that a few of the witnesses who initially are on the side of the defendant, the alleged slanderer, Sarah Bridgman, switch sides as time goes along. And there's even some evidence that local town officials, who seem to have been rather inclined to favor Mary Parsons and to support the prosecution in this case, that they sort of put some pressure on the Bridgman side. So in the end, it sort of is clear that Mary Parsons is the plaintiff, as I say, wins out, and the verdict of the court comes down accordingly. Well, let me say a little bit about the 1674 case, too. We actually know much less about the 1674 case, unless you Northampton historians have turned up a big file of documents which I couldn't find years ago. I looked far and wide, and long and hard, for the depositional evidence, the individual testimonies in the 1674 case, but I was never able to find them. So what we basically know is that there was a serious witchcraft prosecution against Mary Parsons. Now, this is no longer slander. She's in the dock. She's accused of performing very damaging acts of witchcraft against her neighbors. And the limited evidence we do have makes it clear that the main specific charge against her is that she caused the death of a woman named Mary Bartlett, a young woman, I believe 21 or 22 years old, who had died just before under seemingly strange circumstances. And that the case against Mary Parsons, the actual witchcraft prosecution now, was pushed especially hard by the husband and father of this woman who had just died, Mary Bartlett. Who was Mary Bartlett? She was the daughter of Sarah Bridgman. So the leading proponents of the prosecution of Mary Parsons in this second case are, in fact, James Bridgman, the husband of Sarah, and his son, his son-in-law, who had married his daughter, Mary. The son-in-law was Samuel Bartlett. That's why she's married. She's really Mary Bridgman Well, it's a long and I think probably quite elaborate case, for which, as I say, alas, we've lost a lot of the crucial evidence. But in the end, Mary Parsons is acquitted. So in a sense, she's won 2 times. She won the original slander case sort of as plaintiff in her own behalf, and she has defeated the attempt finally to convict her of witchcraft, which would have led to, presumably, to her execution if she had been convicted. All right, so standing back a little bit from this material, one sees right away that there's a powerful element of a kind of family vendetta here. Parsons' family and the Bridgman family. And it stretches presumably across this 20-year or almost 20-year period separating the 2 cases, and it obviously goes back before the first case began and probably continues after the second one was over and done with. But because it has this family vendetta aspect, it behooves us, or I think it behooves a historian of this event, to look into the family histories of these people as well. I actually made up a little, more or less at the last minute, a little kind of genealogical chart, and made a ridiculously low number of copies. As I say, I had no idea that there would be such many witchcraft fans here today, so I'm not going to pass them out. I'll try to talk from my own copy of this chart and hope it makes some sense to you. I'm going to say about 3 minutes worth on the Parsons side, and then another 3 minutes worth on the Bridgman side. Actually, as to the Parsons side, I guess we might really call it the Bliss-Parsons, Bliss-Parsons side. Mary Parsons, as she was known after she was married, was born Mary Bliss, the daughter of an early settler of Hartford, Connecticut, named Thomas Bliss Jr. And it's really interesting, I think, when you trace out the course of this family's history over a few generations. And since you don't have a chart, I want to just tell you what the bottom line, the main point of this little family history is. The family history, I think of it as kind of like having a kind of V shape. They start a kind of relatively high. They go down rather steeply into some depths, and then they very strikingly recoup. At least from Mary Bliss Parsons' own point of view, I think that's the shape of the curve, so to speak. Mary's grandfather, Thomas Bliss Sr., whose whole life was actually in England in the late 16th and early 17th century, he began as a very prominent citizen of a village in Devonshire, in southwest England, a substantial property holder, an important, I think, an influential local office holder, and so on. But quite early on in his life, he was converted to Puritanism, which was then sort of bubbling up around the countryside where he lived. The short of it is that as time passed, as a kind of activist for Puritanism, he suffered a series of very serious blows to his property, to his prestige. He was in fact in prison, it seems, for a while for his Puritan beliefs. So he's kind of he's the first part of this downhill slope that I was mentioning a minute ago. There comes a time when he seems to, or at least according to family tradition, to have called his sons, including Thomas Bliss Jr., who would be the father of Mary Parsons, called them together and said, look, you better get out. There's not much left for you here. I don't have much to offer. Go to New England, more or less. So they did, several of them, including Thomas Bliss Jr., but he had very little to take with him, Thomas Bliss Jr., I mean. So when he fetched up in Hartford, he appears in the records of Hartford as a very modest sort of yeoman farmer of no particular distinction at all. He died, I think it's around the late 1640s. I didn't write it down. And soon after that, his daughter Mary married Joseph Parsons. And the long and the short of that story is that Joseph Parsons then went from humble circumstances up and up and up until he became probably, well, not for sure the wealthiest man in Northampton. He had moved up the way from Springfield, where they were earlier, in that early married life. But also perhaps the wealthiest man in all of the county, in all of Hampshire County. Certainly his estate, when it was probated after his death in the 1680s, was the largest that had been probated in Hampshire County up to that time. He was initially a fur trader and a kind of merchant of various kinds of goods with Indian people nearby. But then his business activities expanded really all across the Commonwealth. He came to the point where he owned a wharf and a warehouse in Boston. He was a really successful businessman, to use our language, by sort of the middle of his life. So Mary Parsons, having in some sense shared the decline of the Bliss line in England after, and then to some extent also in Hartford, in their first years in New England, then she was suddenly set on a trajectory which was going to carry her very, very high indeed. Just also mention that, well, she was in a sense very successful in her child rearing too. She had 12 pregnancies. 2 of them were twins. So she actually gave birth to 14 children. Alas, both sets of those twins died soon after birth. So if you look at the other 10 pregnancies, 9 of those 10 actually survived to adulthood, which was a good ratio for that time and place. And she was able to see her progeny grow up around her as time passed. Now, quickly switching over to Sarah Bridgman and her family tree. She was born Sarah Lyman, the daughter of a man named Richard Lyman, who was a very well-to-do property holder in Essex, in England, County Essex. I forget the town. But anyway, he too, sort of like Thomas Bliss Sr., began from a very good place in terms of his social position. He and his wife and family migrated to New England in the 1630s. He still was doing well at that point. He was one of the initial founding group coming to Hartford from Cambridge and Boston in the mid to late 1630s. He apparently, in fact, I don't think there's clear evidence of this, suffered some serious reverses in terms of his property en route from Boston to Hartford. A lot of his cattle were lost for, we don't know why, but that was a serious matter. And when he fetches up in Hartford, let's say in the late 1630s, and establishes himself there, he clearly is on some downward course. It's also stated in various kinds of records that he became melancholy, quote unquote, which I think means he was very depressed. Perhaps by these reverses he was experiencing, perhaps by other more personal matters, who knows, but it was melancholy enough so that other people, including his minister, really noticed it and worried about him. And perhaps it even rendered him, somewhat unable to look after himself, but that's not quite clear. He actually died in 1640 and left only a very modest amount of property to his heirs. His wife died soon after that. Sarah, his daughter Sarah, who had been born in 1620, was then just reaching the age of majority, and she married in very short order after the deaths of her 2 parents, James Bridgman, who was a very humble householder, first in Hartford, and then moved to Springfield, and then a while after that, when Northampton was founded, came here. James Bridgman and his wife Sarah remained kind of at the lower level of the population in terms of property and office holding and things like that. They were very ordinary souls in both Springfield and Northampton, where they lived. So if you imagine a kind of line or curve for this family history, the second family history, the line to Bridgman line, it starts like the Parsons story, going from kind of high to quite low, but then there's no reverse going back up. In fact, it basically levels out. It might even have tailed off a little more. There are some other pieces I could tell you about the Lyman, especially the Lyman, Sarah Bridgman's brothers and so on, which I think, if anything, add to the effect of these comparative lines I'm trying to draw. But you can see there is basically similarity between, some important kinds of similarity between these two family histories in the first part, and then a very different pattern in the second part. It's interesting, I think, in this case, that local remembrance of Mary Parsons, and I'm really talking sort of after her lifetime in some part, is that she was a haughty, quote-unquote, woman, arrogant, and one phrase that stands out in my mind and actually appears in the title that is given to this talk is she excited jealousy with her social privilege. And so if jealousy is a kind of theme that in some sense surrounds her life, one might imagine that Sarah Bridgman was particularly well positioned to feel jealousy. That's really where I want to make all this now. Standing back from the whole business a little bit and looking at the case as a whole, I want to say just a couple of more things about its, you might say, its typicality or not in relation to the whole run of early New England witchcraft cases. In some ways, it's different. Mary Parsons as the witch in this case is different. For one thing, in that she is, or at least in the later part of her life, is so well-to-do and so powerfully positioned in terms of the local community. Most accused witches were actually at the lower end of the social spectrum. Another thing to say about her is that it seems that suspicion of her, suspicion around her, seems to have developed at a really quite unusually young age. She was in her mid-30s, I guess, no, even younger than that. I think she was not yet 30 in I think she was born in 1628, so in 1656 she was in her late 20s. And if she was even earlier than that suspected in connection with the Springfield witchcraft case, which I mentioned in passing, that takes it right back into her early 20s. Well, the vast majority of accused witches in early New England, in fact, were suspected beginning in their, what we would call their middle age, their 40s or early to mid-50s. So in that sense, she is atypical. In other respects, I think the case is wholly typical of the broad run of such cases. Very striking, for one thing, about the importance of sort of local gossip and rumor and talk in developing these suspicions. When I was reading that first of the depositions that I offered you as a kind of flavoring device, I realized as I was saying it, that so-and-so says, that so-and-so says, that so-and-so had said, and so forth and so on. It's hard to figure out. A lot of different people talking about other people talking. And that's crucial, I think, to almost every witchcraft case that I know about. Secondly, it's clear that there's a kind of basic neighborhood context. These are people who sort of more or less know each other over the back fence. I asked Carrie Buckley as we were walking over here an hour ago how close the Bridgman home lot was to the Parsons. We were actually in historic Northampton. The building is on the Parsons home lot. I was hoping he'd tell me that it was right next door to the Bridgman lot. he didn't or couldn't tell me that. He said the Bridgman lot was some lots, several lots away. But basically it was all in the same surrounding. These are people who knew each other, interacted with each other at close quarters every day. That too is wholly typical. You find that again and again. There are some cultures, in fact, where witches and their accusers will even come from different communities, and their witches are sort of strangers to their accusers, but not in this New England situation. Well, finally, witchcraft as a matter of local reputation and long continuance. It is again about what people are thinking and saying about their neighbors all the time, and it goes on and on. And that leads me actually to what I can use as a closing point for this little lecture, because there is a kind of postscript, it turns out. I remember how astonished I was to find this. My memory is that it came late in the research I did on this case. But I noticed that in the year, I think it's 1702, I don't seem to have written it down. It's into the 18th century, 17-something. So it's almost 30 years, maybe even more than 30 years after the second of the court cases. There's an interesting little note in the records of the local magistrates of the town, and I'll just read it out loud to you as it appears on the record, and then I'll say a bit about it. Mr. Pelatiah Glover, complaining against Betty Negro. Betty Negro would have been a local slave. All of these African American, and there were some slaves in town. All of the African Americans would have been slaves. I don't know to which household Betty Negro actually belonged. Anyway, Mr. Pelatiah Glover, complaining against Betty Negro for bad language to his son Pelatiah Jr., I guess, who came and was present, charging Betty that she told him that his grandmother had killed 2 persons across the river, and had killed Mrs. Pinchon, and half killed the colonel, and that his mother was half a witch. To which Richard White and Tom Negro also gave in evidence that she said on Monday night, the 5th of January, when then Betty owned it and admitted that she had so said. We find her very culpable for her base tongue and words as aforesaid. We sentence, said Betty, to be well whipped on the naked body by the constable with 10 lashes well laid on, and so forth and so on. So, in short, this African-American woman, this slave woman, talking to this young boy, Pelatiah Glover Jr., it said, hey, your grandmother was a witch and she killed some people, and your mother was half a witch. Who were these people? Pelatiah Glover Jr. was the grandson of Mary Parsons, as you probably guessed already. So that's the witch who killed people who was referred to here in the statement. And Mary Parsons' daughter, I forget her name, but she was the mother of this boy, Pelatiah. She was half a witch. Only half, because it came from just one side. So anyway, the point there is simply that it did go on and on. This is now Mary Parsons, very late into her life. I'm guessing it's maybe fully 60 years that this woman, Mary Parsons, has lived with the reputation of being a witch. He's never kind of had to, quote, pay for it in the sense of, being convicted of performing acts of witchcraft. He won that slander case earlier against her, or that she prosecuted earlier on. But no doubt, in other ways, she paid for it quite seriously. I'll stop right there.
We're going to open the floor for questions just a little bit. We're going to wait until after a demonstration to open the floor up for questions, but we're going to have to set up our equipment right now for a little while. Are there a couple of questions for John? Yeah.
Vice President, yeah.
I wonder if you could say anything more about the legal culture that allows suspicion and hearsay and so on in a close community. Not that hearsay isn't still a problem in our courts, but it seems to be so impossible to be taken seriously by a court of law.
Okay, one of the biggest categories of court cases in early New England are cases for slander and defamation. Not just having to do with witchcraft, but having to do with almost everything under the sun. These people are constantly taking each other to court for things that others have said about them, which I suppose in a very almost simple-minded sense simply suggests the importance of local reputation. In small communities which proceed on the basis of face-to-face, quote-unquote, relationships, I think reputation was hugely important. So if I call you a bad name, it really could have consequences unless you defend yourself. And sometimes that meant literally taking me to court or someone like
Of course, she was acquitted.
she was acquitted, and often these cases resulted in acquittal. Some portion of these cases were in fact specifically about witchcraft. There are, I would say, powerful witchcraft cases that one can recover, which actually are only visible by way of slander court cases on the court records. But it's clear that they were deeply felt and closely pursued, and you learn a lot from them. But I think to be called a witch, in fact, was no doubt one of the worst things that could possibly happen. Yes.
Do you know if she had been found guilty, what her punishment was?
Well, I think she would have been sentenced to death. I mean, witchcraft was clearly a capital crime. So she should have been, in some sense, punished to death. Although I do have to say that in many cases, other cases I've studied, where there was a conviction of one or another, quote-unquote, witch, things happened afterwards. There were appeals, or sometimes the judges, and these were jury trials, and it was a capital case, sometimes the judges had ways to set the verdict aside because they were not persuaded. Contrary to what may be popular impression, to be brought into court on a charge of witchcraft was not an automatic conviction or sentence of death. The majority of such cases, in fact, resulted either in acquittal or hung jury or some kind of verdict which did not go against the defendant. Yes?
Do you find that the punishment leads out to the original still on the right side, given the fact that she's only asked to recant her slander?
I think that's it.
Would that possibly have contributed to Mary Parsons being continually considered a witch in later years?
That's a terrific point. I never thought of that.
Can you repeat that?
Yeah, we couldn't hear it.
The point is, the question is, wasn't the sentence that the court handed down in the slander case against Sarah Bridgman, wasn't the verdict of the court rather mild? All she had to do was go and recant. I guess I'd say two things. I mean, in many cases, there would have been a significant, I think usually a monetary kind of punishment. You know, pay a lot of money to the plaintiff. That didn't happen here. And that says to me that the court was a little doubtful. May even have wished to put Mary Parsons on, I'm making this up, but I've seen similar kinds of things. The court is rendering a kind of complicated verdict, which is meant to put the so-called witch on notice for the future, although they're not actually convicting.
John is going to come back and answer questions in just a minute. And I'm sure you'll have more, and John has a lot of historical fact, anecdotal knowledge to share with us. Before we open the floor for questions, we have a unique opportunity to explore another dimension of this case, and indeed to get at the very heart of the historical enterprise itself. Today's museums are more than repositories, they're learning centers. Historic Northampton is a museum and Education Center, and we're constantly seeking ways to maximize our resources to serve the cultural and educational needs for the broadest constituency. And when we planned this lecture series to coincide with Northampton's 350th anniversary, we sought to bring history back home, to emphasize the real significance of our community's history by highlighting the work of nationally recognized scholars who have defined the history of our region over the last 25 years. And the anthology that will be based on this lecture series, we hope will be a resource for further exploration and will also promote further research on our region's history and culture. But we also hope to redefine the notion and the way we look at local history itself. To paraphrase Tip O'Neill, all history is local. It's at the local level where history happens and where historians can see larger forces at work. Local history can be a touchstone for exploring the fundamental and underlying issues in the broad sweep of American history, not only for scholars, but also in the classroom, in our classrooms, and for students at the elementary and secondary level. Each one of these lectures, each part of this lecture series, each chapter of the forthcoming book, and the scholarship upon which these lectures are based. Each one of these is a case study. It stands by itself to a certain extent, but frames not only local issues, but very important issues in the stream of American history, which we can see through the lens of a local event. And we believe that an effective way for students to learn the content, those areas upon which they are increasingly and arbitrarily evaluated, is through community-based learning that reinforces these abstract concepts with the actual building blocks of history, the primary sources upon which these concepts are based. So with the support of the Massachusetts Foundation for the Humanities, Historic Northampton initiated a partnership with the Center for Computer-Based Instructional Technology at UMass to develop a resource, an online website based on John Demos's work on this Goudy Parsons witchcraft case, making all the 17th century documents that John used in his research available online, and then by working with area teachers to develop grade-appropriate curriculum for grades 3, 5, and middle school. This is a model, a prototype, which I hope we can expand in other case studies, and it's a model that can be replicated in other communities and other school districts. A number of people, many people have been involved in this project. Bridget Marshall, who began the initial research and development of this project. I'm sorry she cannot be with us today. It's a family illness. But I'll have to say that this project would have remained just an idea. Someone told me that there are two kinds of projects, good ones and finished ones. This one is still in process, but this project would have remained only an idea without the leadership and the technical expertise of David Hart, who is the director of the Center for Computer-Based Instructional Technology at UMass. And please join me in welcoming David, who's going to give us a demonstration of this exciting project. And we're going to open up the floor. After you've absorbed all these primary documents, you'll have more questions to ask John, I'm sure, and perhaps more to ask David and Michael Sullivan, who's here to represent teachers. David.
Thank you, Gary. This is really Bridget's talk to do. I should start by saying that. It really was Bridget who carried this through to where it became something that we could sink our teeth into. I'm with a group at UMass that develops instructional technology for a variety of settings. The university is one of our primary places where we develop things and roll them out. We've done a lot of K-12 history projects that had their start at the university, working with Stephen Nissenbaum on a course about Lizzie Borden that he taught for many years, and trying to figure out ways to use the computer technology, the web, and so forth, to sort of enhance the pedagogy. Steve's a wonderful teacher, but he became fascinated by the possibilities. And for us, it led to sort of an interest in history that has carried through to such projects as we helped develop the American Centuries website. Some of you may have seen that from Deerfield. A lot of work in local school settings, Amherst, Pelham, Hatfield, some of the Quabbin schools, looking at the history of the Quabbin and the relationship of the towns that were flooded to the towns that are still there, and those sorts of things, the Springfield Armory. All of these projects have the goal of connecting schools with the local historical societies or museums in order to excite kids and excite teachers about history by looking at the local story, things that they can understand once they sort of see it. And I'll show some examples of that with respect to this project. Our staff has historians, K-12 educators, a number of interns from the public history program at UMass, and that all helps this to go. This project has had 3 phases. The first was when Bridget actually made a trip to Salem in 1999 and sort of came away from that experience thinking there wasn't a lot of history that I saw here about the Salem witch trials. And in her words, she sort of described it as it's Halloween every day in Salem. But it really drove for her an interest in witchcraft that turned to the Demos book, Entertaining Satan, and the Northampton story. It was local for her, being a UMass student, and something that with Carrie's help she could really sink her teeth into. That research phase was followed by a second phase in 2001 and 2002, where Dr. Victoria Geddes, who worked with us, a historian, worked with Bridget and Carrie to take the story that Bridget had sort of woven from the Demos book and create an exhibit website out of that. And there was an opening in October of 2002 of that, which was both a physical and a virtual exhibit in the Parsons house. Some of you may have attended that. And phase 3 of this project has been to work with Michael Sullivan and Barry Wadsworth at the Smith Campus School, Michael's at John F. Kennedy Middle School, to reshape the website into an educational website, and I'll show you what that means in a few moments. I should point out this is all funded by the Massachusetts Foundation for the Humanities, for which we're grateful. Bridget's research carried her to the Northampton Registry of Probate, to the Massachusetts Archives, the Connecticut Valley Historical Museum, searching for the primary sources involved in this, starting with what was in the Demos research and sort of trying to push out from there. Lots of old maps, lots of documents. Actually, I shouldn't say lots. There's a finite number of materials associated with this case, which makes it interesting for an application like this because you can sort of lay it all out. It's all there. You don't have to worry about some other sources, unless they can be found, that are going to change the story. From a historian's point of view, you've got a set of sources, and you can turn that into an educational application without too much worry about what you call and what you include. In creating the exhibit website, our point was to tell the story, to provide the primary sources. So when I show it to you in a moment, you'll see that lots of the sources are there. Some timelines and genealogies as sort of an aid to help. And Bridget collected some of the theories about witchcraft cases, especially the Salem case, that would perhaps explain some of what was going on, particularly in the case of the Salem hysteria. In creating the educational website, we found that we then had to sort of reorganize the material. And working with Michael and Barry, it was clear that the sort of expository format of the exhibit was both a little bit over the heads of students, particularly at the 5th grade level, but also gave away a little bit too much of the story. There wasn't enough work on the students' part, having to sort of dig through and think for themselves about what was going on. So we reorganized the story. Michael and Barry created curriculum activities, and we worked together with them to do that so that we can figure out how we can support that with the web application. A number of things that we did to help in that, the most important of which is the creation of some interactive learning aids, and I'll show those in a minute. But classroom testing was also very important, and we've just gone through a site revision based on the feedback we've gotten from the teachers and from the students. Let me see. switch now to show you the exhibit website. In this site, we tell the story. This is actually not Goudy Parsons. There's no picture of Goudy Parsons existing. But this is a period picture of a woman that sort of gives you a sense of the time. From this starting point, we present the story, and Bridget wrote this out based on her research and following the lines of what you've just heard. The Mary Bliss Parsons story. We go to the next, we'll see the context, where these families came from in England, where different families from England settled, and what impact that had on the way the families came together, their fortunes, as Professor Demos was saying, on the downswing, and then in the Parsons case on the upswing again. The story of the slander trial, and then the subsequent story of the witchcraft trial 18 years later. There's also some timeline sorts of helping aids that turn out to be useful in some of the school projects, just trying to get the timeline straight. There's several ways of looking at it. It can be separated by family, so that you can sort of trace the history of the two families side by side. And that's sort of helpful at tracking this complicated story of what's going on. And finally, some information, the theories of witchcraft that Bridget compiled. There are various cultural readings of what was happening with witchcraft. There are some medical theories presented about different kinds of diseases that in particular, the Salem case, the young girls involved might have been getting from rye that was rotting before it was used in their food. There are more recent arguments about the relationship to the King Philip's War. So there are lots of interesting theories, and Bridget goes into these in some detail here. Let me switch now to the educational side.
Can we see some of the documents first, Dave?
Sure.
Those are at the other side too, that may be easier.
Well, let me,
The testimonies, I think they're both.
okay. I breezed over, I meant to show one at this point. The testimony of William Hannum's wife and William Hannum himself. William Hannum was the one who had the cow that died in the slander trial. And this is what that testimony looks like in the account books, the court records. And since this is hard to read, obviously, because it's hard to read the handwriting, you have the second problem of understanding the language that's involved. But this is the transcript of what we're in. I understand it's very hard to read from back there. But within that transcript, you see the reference down in this area to the cow that died. His impressions of why the cow died. And later, I think the story is that the cow was skinned and it was found to have water in its belly that would have made it die sort of natural causes, even though it seemed to die very suddenly at the time. And so these documents are part of the exhibit website, and as Michael said, have been carried over into the educational website as well.
What is the address of the website?
That's going to be my last slide. Please remind me to go back to that again. But you can get to it from the Historic Northampton website, and that's actually the address that I'm going to give you. We recreated the story. Essentially, Bridget rewrote it, working with us and with the teachers. And so the language is simpler, the concepts are a little bit simpler. And as I said, we're giving away less. There's more the students have to do to go start digging into it. The documents were better organized. After having the classes work with the documents, both at the 5th grade and the 8th grade level, we realized we sort of had to number them so they could be referred to in student activities and things like that. But also, they're organized a little better along the lines of the different sets of testimony, the way they came in, as you were hearing earlier. And working with the teachers, we designed and created some interactive activities that allowed the students to get in and really work with some of the old materials. This is an old map of Northampton. This is a little bit after the slander trial, so there's something like 60 house plots here. There were 32 or 33 at the time of the trial. But this particular way of looking at this map was created for the 5th graders. Various students were having a hard time locating themselves and looking at this map. If you look at, this is the Joseph Parsons home plot, and it sits today at the corner of Bridge Street and Hawley Street and Market Street. So those are the lights where the Del Rey is and the post office is. And here's a picture, of the Parsons house, which is at that corner. And there's a picture of the post office. And so the kids can kind of click around on this and figure out that up here where Henry Woodard lived is Smith College. And so they can kind of locate themselves. At the time, the Mill River was flowing through town and hadn't been diverted, and that's always a puzzler when you look at this map. But King Street was running up this way. And if you look down in the south end of town, there's Sylvester's. So that helps you sort of get your bearings. We were talking earlier about where the relative positions were of the lots. The Parsons lot was here, as I showed. The Bridgman lot is down here, which would have been down Hawley Street, I suppose. Pleasant Street, I'm sorry. And so they were about 4 or 5 house lots removed. And bear in mind, these lots are big. This is like 2 or 3 of the blocks that we have today. So the Parsons lot ran all the way up to the Bridge Street School where the cemetery is, and probably over to Joe's Pizza, somewhere up to Union Street perhaps. So this helped the students get their bearings. Once they got their bearings, we provided another view of the same map that would actually take and for the different house plots, the different families, show where they took sides. In other words, there were something like 15 of the families involved in this, either taking the side of Mary Parsons or taking the side of Sarah Bridgman, or as court officials, and in some cases switching sides as the trial went on. And so the key to this shows the supporters, obviously Joseph's a supporter, John Bliss was a supporter, the near neighbors. This is William Hannum with the cow, was three lots over, and was the one who switched his allegiance halfway through. The Bridgmans obviously are bringing the case. There's another supporter there. There's, I think, there's a court official there. Probably the wealthiest man living in the center of town was one of the court officials. And so the students can use this to get some sense for the people in town of how they lined up and just how much this involved the entire town. There were also the Springfield people that were involved, and their relative allegiances are shown over here. And finally, in order to help students get a better sense of the sort of time span of what was going on in New England at the time, particularly with regard to witchcraft, but also the Indian Wars and the various things that were happening, we constructed a timeline sort of activity. And this takes data from the appendix in Professor Demo's book and places it both in time and in place. And so we can look at things like settlement patterns in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, and also where the witchcraft cases were found. So if I click here, you'll see the little triangular icons represent the settlements. In 1631, there were Salem, Boston, and Plymouth, and no cases of witchcraft. We'll see little witches' hats appear in a moment. By 1640, that had changed. There are many more settlements, and we see the first case of witchcraft, and if we click on that, Jane Hawkins, dated 1638 in Boston. There was a complaint and an indictment, but there's no execution or no conviction in that case. By 1650, we watched the settlement pattern, and the settlements are moving up the rivers, and in particular, thinking about Western Massachusetts, really it was more closely related to Connecticut than it was to Eastern Mass. Its geography separated them, but the river allowed easy passage. And suddenly we see that there are as many witchcraft cases in Springfield, and these are the earlier cases that we were just talking about, as there are in the rest of the state, almost. With Hartford, that's a bit more. But, so the activity around Springfield, I wouldn't call it a hotbed of witchcraft, but these accusations were happening in Springfield with greater frequency than they were in most of the rest of New England at that point. But by 1660, we see there are lots of reports up here in the Boston area and the Salem area. This is a Cambridge case. These are Gloucester cases. Again, there's a slander charge in this case, complaint, indictment, but there are very few executions. It really very seldom reach that point. So I think I'll stop there and turn it over to Michael. Before I do, let me switch back to the and put up the website. And this is the link, Historic Northampton, at www.historic-northampton.org. If you go to the virtual exhibits button on that link, Carrie, is that right?
It's not Windows in Time?
I think it's called Windows in Time under virtual exhibits.
Well, actually, it's on the side of it, Windows in Time is now a separate one. So that'll get you to the main exhibit, and if you link from that, that'll get you to the education.
And what I put at the bottom is a direct link, which there's some flyers in the back of the table that you're welcome to take with you, which has this link. So I just didn't want people to get confused between the two. It's the same site. One more thing before I turn it over to Michael. We're going to have a teacher workshop to bring other teachers from the area into this. Michael and Barry are going to help us do this in about 3 weeks. And there's also a flyer in the back if there are any teachers, or if you know any teachers who might be interested in such a thing. Michael?
Sure, I'll just say a couple things real quickly. It's an amazing process for teachers to be able to work with these talented folks. Sure.
Oh, okay.
To take, what's really the star of all this is the primary source documents that I write in downtown in the hall of records, right? And so we wanted to make those accessible to kids. And so you start with one of them, at least one of the anybody's court testimony. So for us, I teach 8th grade, how do you make that accessible to kids? Well, you look at the original language, and it's really neat for them to see it, but they can't really read it. So you let them mess with that for a bit, and then you give them the transcript like this. And when you start reading the transcript, the language and everything is really challenging. But they find that it's worth it because you read about Joseph Parsons, beating his son for coming home with only one shoe. And, why is that such a big deal? Well, how much do shoes cost back then? So there's a lot of little interesting detail to it. But before you can get the kids to appreciate that John Matthews changed his testimony because the guy that took his testimony is John Pinchon, and he's his neighbor, and he's the kingpin of Springfield. Why would this guy change it? There's lots and lots of levels to this that make it a fascinating story, but it's really complicated. And you can't just lecture 8th graders, and they're also, the more visual you can be, the better. So when we teamed up with David, it was amazing what we could come up with. We already had that downtown map, and so I had the experience of saying, yeah, that's over by Northampton Lumber, or that would be. So instead of me needing to say that, to click those spots on that map, and for the kids to see it like that, it really works really well. Also, Professor Demos mentioned the tale of the two families literally coming to America at the same time, coming to Hartford at the same time, struggling in Springfield and then coming to Northampton. With that southern New England map, David didn't show it, but there's icons for Bridgman and Parsons, and you can follow them literally on the map as they make it to Northampton. And other things you see when you start doing timelines, you find out that Joseph Parsons, their 5th child, the first European or white child born in Northampton in the spring of 1655, you come across anecdotal stuff that he dies in the first summer or fall of the fighting that King Philip's War up in Northfield. And there's just lots and lots of anecdotal stuff that helps. These maps really help to show that Northampton was a frontier town for a while. We were on the edge of the English in North America, and we were much more connected to Connecticut and the river than going eastward to Boston. And so there's a lot here. There's a lot to understand about what justice meant in days before kind of the logic and thinking of science, and how people would the kids complain about this testimony. She said, wait, how could this stand up in court? And they get that. And those are the kinds of things that become much more alive because of the way we're able to set it up with the website. Thanks.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Michael. I'm going to give Michael a wonderful hand because he represents the best kind of teacher. I wish I had a teacher like that in middle school. I want to open the floor up to questions. First, I want to ask, how many of you here are Parsons descendants? Take a look, John. How many Bridgman descendants? There you go. All right. All history is local, right? I'll tell you a little anecdote here. John Putnam Demos, what John was telling me about in the process of his research, he discovered, sort of late on, that he was indeed related to the Putnams, who were part of the Salem witchcraft goings-on and proceedings and so forth. It sort of raised the hairs on the back of his neck. And I have to confess, not long ago, I had a call from a genealogist, and my family, my dad was from Michigan and small farmers, and sort of lost the track in New York State during the burned over district, so to speak. So I never really knew much beyond that, but I got a call from a researcher, and to make a long story short, he was researching the Chapman family, who married into the Bliss family, who married a Buckley, and so there's a direct line to Thomas Bliss through his daughter Mary Bliss, who is the sister, his daughter, it's not Mary, I'll have to look it up. But at any rate, my job happens to be in a building that's right on the Parsons home lot. It was laid out in 1654. So that doesn't exactly raise the hairs on the back of my neck, but it is a small world. So, but again, you have to understand that if you multiply 9 generations, it takes 6 children for each generation, and multiply that by to the 9th power, you'll get an idea of how many New England descendants can claim that kind of genealogy. Well, at any rate, before we move on, John, do you want to come up, and David, maybe Michael too, and I'm sure you guys have some more questions, and there's one way back there. John, you want to field?
I wanted to ask a question about Mary Parsons. I believe that she was convicted or bound over locally, and she went to Boston and was acquitted in Boston, and actually spent a few months in a jail cell. But my memory is that in the course of the trial, it said she spoke for herself, and that she in effect acted as her own lawyer. And I was wondering if, I think it's a lot more creditable that she was the first woman lawyer in Northampton than she was the first. But was that common or uncommon for a married woman to speak for herself in a proceeding of that nature?
It seems to have been very uncommon, and I do think it's one of the striking aspects of the case. And there are other kinds of evidence that she was a very forceful, sometimes outspoken woman, and no doubt I imagine, no doubt her personality, in some sense her character, was part of the whole package that was brought to bear against her. But I think that I didn't mention that detail, but you're absolutely right. She is recorded as having spoke on her own behalf.
Can I ask a question? Could you put that local map back on?
I think I attempted a map of that same general kind years ago,
when I was doing my own research, but this is better than anything I had. I'm so struck by this as I look at it. Several things. George Langdon. The first testimony I read to you was by this man, and it was he and his wife. His wife and Sarah Bridgman, and they were next door neighbors. So they were. That was part of the gossip network. I was very struck by this name appearing in the next lot to the Bridgmans, Robert Lyman. Robert Lyman is Sarah Bridgman's brother. And she has two other brothers in town, one of whom I see here, Richard and John, they're over here. Well, their story, in terms of these family sequences, as it were, that I tried to suggest, the story of these three brothers is also kind of interesting and suggestive. The gist is that these two guys over here rose up from the relatively humble position to which the family had descended, and not as dramatically as Joseph Parsons, but their life, they really improved their position a lot as time went on. In a sense, you might say that they kind of reclaimed the birthright to which they had been born as the sons of the first Richard Lyman. Robert Lyman, by contrast, the dramatic contrast, if I recall, went sort of really downhill. I think he was in trouble with the law. I think he was convicted of several different kinds of crimes. I think he was considered to be sort of shiftless and maybe sort of semi-insane by the end of his life. So he even went lower. So around her, Sarah had, right around her, she had this one brother, very troubled life. Right next to her was kind of really going off a cliff almost. And then she had these two other brothers who were going back up to where her family had originally started. And she was kind of stuck in the lower levels. In a sense, if you want to kind of summarize all this, I think of this in terms of the birthright issue, which was very active on both sides of this family conflict. Because I have to emphasize that Joseph, what he did was really remarkable. That was 1 in 1,000 in early life. He went right all the way to the top. Although he never, if I remember correctly, he never became Mr. Joseph Parsons. Some of you may know that Mr. was actually a term of preferment in those. Not everybody was Mr. Most men were Goodman. But if you were in the elite, if you were in the top tier, you got to be called Mr., or your wife would be Mrs. Joseph and Mary were never Mr. and Mrs. I think that was a kind of little reminder of where they had started. Yeah.
I understand that the first witch hanging in Connecticut was a woman from Windsor, Connecticut.
That's right.
And it occurred in Hartford at what is now called the Yellowstone Bookstore Center. And I found it quite interesting that most of the stories that I've read, the accusers are other women against women.
That's
Very
right.
few men accusers. Did you find any?
Well, I think accusations sort of within the cohort, especially of women between the ages of 40 and 60, that was the central group as I was able to find it. Often those were the primary, the ones that seemed to carry the most force. However, quite a number of men also got into the act, often supporting the charges of witchcraft. And for reasons that are quite comparable, for instance, to William Hammond, whose deposition we looked at, Hammond, I guess it was whose deposition we looked at a minute ago, the man who had the cow who died. It's interesting, the men would typically bring forward accusations based on losses of property. The women would bring forward accusations based on illness or death, in some cases, to their children, as was the case with Sarah Bridgman and her infant child. There was something of a collaboration across the gender line there, but I think you're right to say that probably most powerful of all were the accusations from women like the accused. Yeah.
Yeah, you sort of skipped over very quickly.
I'm not sure
The
who's
part where Joseph Parsons locks his wife in the
Oh,
basement.
yeah.
Could you elaborate on that one?
Yeah. There's a fair amount of this kind of testimony about conflict within that family. I mentioned that the locked in the basement episode, and one of the other speakers
can't remember which one, but mentioned how one time their son came home having lost his shoe, and there ensued a family fracas of some kind, in which Joseph started to beat the son for having done this, and Mary apparently intervened and tried to protect the little boy. And there were other testimonies of trouble sort of between the married couple. It's interesting that this is brought forward. I think it somehow, in the minds of the people who were there, it seems to weigh against Mary Parsons in this
Not
case.
against Joseph.
I've been very interested in this case for about 6 months now, and that's related to the Parsons also. Apparently there was an intermarriage between the two families 3 generations later.
Yeah.
And it almost seems like a Romeo and Juliet coming together. I mean, how could two people, young people from the families that almost killed one another, manage to marry so soon? Are you one of those guys too?
Time heals. I really don't know about those later generations, although I'm very struck by the fact, as you are.
It's grandchildren, I believe, get married. And in the more adult website, Bridget's website, there's a mention of it. She has a very extensive timeline.
Yes?
A broad question. It seems one of the attractions to students and for this kind of multimedia kind of presentation and witchcraft itself is you're finding it sort of a sensational kind of deal. There are these kind of, another one I'm thinking of would be really wonderful for Northampton is the anti-slavery period in Northampton and the contrast there. But isn't there a danger in a way with this? For a professional historian of dealing with sensationalism as a hook to real history in a sense, how do you kind of balance it out when you say that history is a lot about normal life too, you know?
Oh yeah, I in a sense I thought of my own project as I began it long ago to desensationalize the study of witchcraft, to disconnect it from the particular, very special association it has around in these parts with Salem, and that, which in many ways was a very unusual, well, in some ways was a very unusual, in other ways it was a very ordinary business. We could do a whole other lecture on Salem that I'll spare you. But all the same, yes, normal life is really what, as a social historian, I'm most interested in. And really my fundamental point here is that witchcraft is part of normal life. It was, if we could have a time machine and drop down out of the sky in Northampton 350 years ago and stop people as they went down the street and say, what can you tell us about witchcraft? Everybody would have had stories to tell us. Some people would have said, I was victimized by Parsons or whatever. And that would have been true all across the landscape, which is just another way of saying that it was a presence for everybody, more or less, all the time. I don't mean that they were obsessed with it and that's all they could talk about, or far from it. But it was one of their sort of everyday concerns.
I have 2 questions. Do you think that Mary Parsons' age, being that she was younger than most of the accused witches, and her influence in the society, being that she was a lot richer than the usual people who were accused, do you think that played any part in her acquittal?
I don't know. If only we had those depositions from the witchcraft trial of 1674. I just am not sure. It did occur to me, and I think I write about this in the book chapter on this case, that she would have known, she must have known personally the magistrates who were sitting up at the front of the court. The jury was actually deciding her fate, but the magistrates were all present. This was the Court of Assistants, the highest, the governing body, as it were, of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts that was meeting to hear this case. She would have had a personal connection to them all. Whether she found a way, in a sense, to use that connection as the proceedings went forward, who knows? I mean, again, without more detailed evidence, we just can't be sure. But it's a good possibility.
And in the case of Matthew Haddam, do you think it was perhaps, I'm speculating, that he was a man with a sick cow and he was looking to get a new cow, and so he taxed the richest people in the neighbourhood AKA, like just as people are attacking big business, sometimes justifying so, but ambulance chasing, looking
Yeah, but I don't think, I mean, if you meant literally, is that the best odds for getting money to buy a new cow?
perhaps, yeah.
I don't think there's any way in which the slander case could have been decided that would have given him the money for a new cow. He may have been jealous of them, as I think Sarah Bridgman herself was. But more to the point, frankly, I think, is that this was somebody who had been already identified in the minds of a lot of people in town who did things by way of witchcraft that caused cows to die or whatever. There was, as I remember, there were 2 cows, one of which died with water in the belly. That was mentioned here. I think the other one was actually bitten by a rattlesnake as it walked down the path. Now that in itself, I guess, seemed strange, or it presumably happened from time to time. But there would also be the question, why this cow at this time is when the rattlesnake walked by? There was some room in there to wonder about witchcraft. Yes?
Can you speak a little bit about the role of the church ministry involved in this particular witchcraft trial?
There's almost no record of the church being involved in this case.
Although it was common, wasn't it?
It was more or less common, not always. One of the kind of main points and very general points that witchcraft historians have tried to make over the last 30 years is that witchcraft stretched, the concern with witchcraft stretched across a very broad spectrum. On the one end is kind of ground level witchcraft, which is all about cows dying and beer going bad in the barrel and little homely incidents and so forth between neighbors. At the other end of the spectrum are ministers and theorists about religion and society and whatever, mainly ministers, for whom witchcraft is a matter of a kind of cosmic struggle between God on the one hand and Satan on the other, and their various forces. And it's very, one of the things that really strikes me about the Northampton case is that the devil is, I think, never mentioned in any of the testimonies. I could be wrong, but by and large, it's not a proceeding at that end of the spectrum at all. Salem, to draw that contrast again, was at that end of the spectrum quite a lot. And some other cases were sort of mixed in the middle.
But I mean, I have a recollection somewhere of reading where Reverend Stoddard had examined someone who was thought to have been a victim.
Been a victim?
Oh, I think it wasn't, I can't recall. But that it was, that he had been asked to be involved with the case. But I'm not, I couldn't
There were some cases where ministers did get involved to a considerable extent, and others where they didn't. And I don't very well know how to sort them out. In fact, I don't even know who the minister of Northampton was.
Reverend Stoddard considered that case.
Okay.
He was examined for which marks that before that they did send her to Boston for trial.
But that probably didn't involve the minister. That was searching for marks of the devil on the body of the accused, which would really be very damning evidence if they thought they could identify something like that. Yes?
Is Leah and Hugh Parsons of Springfield related to Mary Parsons?
No, different Parsones. They were, actually I think that was a Mary Parsons too. Mary and Hugh Parsons of Springfield. A different Mary Parsons entirely. That's the other case with which the Northampton Mary Parsons also was at least marginally involved.
But she was in prison.
Yes. And died. Right. And Hugh himself, her husband, that's one of those cases where a man was convicted along with a woman. And he fled. He got away before they could really turn him on. Yes.
I was thinking about the question you asked earlier about whether or not Sarah Bridgman's punishment was too lenient. And I know I read an essay by you that really argued that and I'm wondering if for her having to go out publicly recant and reveal shame, was maybe more than maybe it was.
Yes, that's a good point. I think I sort of stopped in the middle of my answer to that. On the one hand, they could have actually imposed a monetary fine, and they didn't. So that seems to weigh on the side of leniency. On the other hand, from the point of view, especially of a rich woman like Mary Parsons, who was the plaintiff in this case, the most important thing by far was that Sarah should go to Northampton and to Springfield too, and say out loud that it was wrong what she had said. I think that was crucial. That was crucial in sort of removing her shame, as it were, but also perhaps was a very shame-inducing kind of experience for Sarah Bridgman.
I think she may have been given the choice to pay the fine or to apologize to Springfield and Northampton. She chose the fine.
Well, I've forgotten that. It's true. Okay.
That's a fine for disobeying the court order. What could not be proven was damages resulting from the slander.
Yes.
Which is the second part of every court case. Because all she could say is, after the slander, I got richer and richer. No problem. So she could cast no damages except you possibly damaged my future reputation. So the only remedy there would be to recant.
Yes?
No, I have a blind spot here. I mean, how was witchcraft defined in the common law of Massachusetts? And at one point, witchcraft trials stopped. And why did they stop? I mean, how is witchcraft, how is it considered the same, let's say, as murder or equal to larceny or whatever other crimes that we could take people to court for?
Oh, it was a very, very serious matter in their minds because it actually could involve murder, and maybe did if you believe Sarah Bridgman that her child had been murdered by Mary Parsons' witchcraft. And more than that, it involved, as the indictments would usually say, and my book title is Entertaining Satan, and I took that from the typical form of an indictment for witchcraft, which was, thou hast given entertainment to Satan. Thou hast, it's a different meaning somewhat of entertainment from the one we're used to, but you have had contact with Satan and then that conjured up the whole idea of joining in Satan's forces in the attempt to throw down the kingdom of God and so forth and so on. So it was, there could be nothing worse than that aspect. Does that mean?
Yeah, but when does witchcraft trials end?
Well, it stops at the very end of the 17th century, essentially. In terms of trials, it stops. I think the Salem trial was crucial there. They felt, as they look back on it a few years later, they felt that things had gone way off track there. Far too many people had been accused and convicted and executed. In a sense, they became increasingly doubtful over time, not about the reality of witchcraft as a possibility, but of their ability to identify individual people as witches. And I think that's the bottom line. And in fact, the belief in witchcraft, never mind now trials and so, but belief in witchcraft, and at least, you might say, informal actions based on such belief continued all through the 18th century, into the 19th century, into the 20th century, maybe in some corners and so on.
Well, didn't the laws and of the books show until the 20th century?
That's right, yeah.
I think it's not like I saw it, that someone, the wife of one of the high civil officials in the Massachusetts government, was accused of witchcraft. And at this point, these men decided they had to cool this, and from that point on, it kind of died out.
At Salem, the target level, so to speak, cycled up as time went on. So that by the end, the wife of the Reverend Cotton Mather, I think maybe the wife of Samuel Sewell, I can't remember, but the wife of the governor, I think even Lady Phipps was getting accused. It started in that lower spectrum, but then when things just really spun out of hand, that was an important part of the result.
There's a question.
Yeah, okay.
I noticed on the website, one of the pictures shown was Sylvester's restaurant. I wonder if the people here are aware that that's the home of Sylvester Graham of the Graham Express.
I'm not aware of it.
If you'll come to our September lecture, you'll hear Steve Nissenbaum talk on Sylvester Graham and his health tools.
I think many people aren't aware of it, and when I was in school, I did a paper on it, and interviewed the people who were running it, and asked, you have no mention that this is his home, I think it's significant. And they said, no, we didn't like his attitude toward women.
Yes.
Towards the question of the punishment in the slander case, would differences in economics at the time, barter versus currency and access to market, played a role in that kind of judgment being a much more serious matter? The loss of reputation had an economic dimension we wouldn't currently really appreciate. And what would the mechanics have been of the actual judgment if she had actually done it? Evidently she's fined for not doing it. Would she have had to go to the courthouse at an appointed time and say to people who could arrive there, I have made slander, I have said untrue things?
Well, I think the recantation, in effect, the taking back, as it were, that always happened in some specified public place. It doesn't, I guess it's not specified, if I remember correctly, in the record in this case. Sometimes it will say in the public meeting house, or it will say in front of the meeting house. The effort is clearly to position it so that a lot of people can be present, can listen, and can take in this recantation. Is that what you're getting at?
Well, that's part of it, and also the other thing, could you comment on what the perhaps economic ramifications could be to a person in that type of economy, the loss of reputation, the loss of your good word? You like to have to say publicly, I'm a person who says untrue things. Would it have an economic dimension that we wouldn't appreciate in terms of business in the town, access to markets?
I think the answer to your question to those points is yes, it would have. But what suddenly occurs to me, and it really, I'm not sure again, I've really thought of it quite this way before, is the impact of all of that, of a slander case on a woman as compared to the man. A man who's a craftsperson in town, a carpenter or whatever, who's accused of being a liar, that would be a fairly common slander case, might lose business in an obvious sense. A woman like Mary Parsons, it's hard maybe to know how she would be damaged in strictly economic terms. Perhaps if she were a midwife, and that was true of some accused witches, she would lose business. I don't think Mary had anything like that going for her.
I'm thinking more of the economic damage to the bridge.
Excuse me, we're running out of time here. We have time for one more question. I don't mean to be rude, but this gentleman has had his hand up quite a while.
Maybe connecting onto this, there's a document, I think, on the website showing that Joseph Parsons was himself accused of lewd and lascivious behavior, ran a tavern, etc. How much more is known of him aside from the fact that of his social and financial status, and how was he affected by all of this?
He was a tough guy, from all I can tell. He was accused of lewd and lascivious behavior to he was one of his neighbors or something like that. I forget the details. He was accused, in effect, of hard business practices at various points along the way. So you can form a picture of him. Just as Mary Parsons seems to have been somewhat more out front and outspoken than the average good wife in town, I think the same kind of comment could be made about him. And that sort of brings us back maybe to the issue of how they fought with each other according to these various testimonies. And they were tough, I think both of them.
John Demos, thank you for scheduled for April the 11th. That's Easter Sunday.